Every living being in Tevat exists and lives under largely different circumstances. But the common thread that ties and binds all of these different lives together is death. Humans, adepti, and even the gods all eventually expire, and there isn't anyone who can avoid this fate. We don't know much about what happens after death, but often it is treated with reverence and respect. There are rituals and customs one must follow, and to go against it might cause tragedy or even disaster. But how does one know the proper steps? This is where the 77th director of the Wangsheng Funeral Parlor, Hutao, comes in. Before we get into that, if you want to see more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Liyue wasn't always such a thriving and prosperous nation. In the distant past, the region was beset by all manners of monsters and malicious gods. Humans led very short lives as death was around every corner. It wasn't until much later did things start to change. When Zhongli manifested, he tried his best to make the region more hospitable for humans and drove the monsters and evil gods away. Eventually, many humans and even friendly gods would come to settle in Guili Assembly under the protection of Rex Lapis and the Adepti. When the Archon War broke out, however, the region was plunged into chaos once more. Guili Assembly was all but destroyed and many gods had lost their lives. This was when Rex Lapis would essentially initiate a crusade to completely rid the region of any evil or malicious creatures, regardless if they were gods or monsters. While initially successful, Rex Lapis had not anticipated one thing. You see, the gods aren't just any living thing. Most are beings of high elemental power, and in death, they often leave behind godly miasma that can corrupt and bring forth demons. This very reason is why Rex Lapis dispatched the Yaksha in order to deal with these up-and-coming demons. Prolonged exposure, however, instead caused the Yaksha to also accrue negative karma, which influenced and spread like a plague, causing many deaths to the humans. These deaths would then further accelerate the spreading process, creating an endlessly accelerating cycle, and Liyue was yet again under threat of being destroyed. While the situation seemed hopeless, it was a doctor from the Hu family that realized that this plague could be curbed by purifying infected bodies through cremation. This is how the Wangsheng Funeral Parlor was first formed, and what its original purpose was. With each person, god and yaksha doing their part, Liyue eventually bounced back, and is now the thriving port city we see today. This is why death is taken quite seriously, as it was once commonplace in ancient Liyue, and without the efforts of many different people, Liyue likely would not have survived. Things have changed though, and not many people recall or realize this part of Liyue's history, save for those who were there or those from the Wangsheng Funeral Parlor. The Wangsheng Funeral Parlor of today still remembers its legacy, but seems to have evolved and serves an additional purpose different from their original roots. In the past, cremation as a burial choice was due to necessity, but the funeral home today is far more flexible. Hutao herself makes it a point to try to accommodate the needs of both the family and the deceased. She wishes to ensure that this part of their life, the transition phase, is done with as little regret and sorrow as possible. Hutao's role in the current setting is really more skewed towards being the ferryman of the deceased, someone who helps those who have died move on to the next life. Throughout the later half of her story quest, we actually see her visit a location known as the Border along with the Traveler. A location said to be a halfway point between the world of the living and the dead. It's not explicitly mentioned that this is her main role now, but it is implied as such. Despite just the implication, there is actually a few things that point us in this direction. Let's first start off with her constellation, Papilio Charontis, or the Butterfly of Charon. Charon was a minor god in Greek mythology who served as the ferryman for souls between the world of the living and the afterlife. So in a way, her constellation seems to make reference to her role now being similar to that of the ferryman. In fact, in the Greek mythology, those who could not pay the fee or did not receive any funeral rites were forced to wait and wander around the river Styx before Charon would ferry them. It's a neat little callback to why Hutao takes funerary rituals so seriously. The butterfly portion of her constellation is also a reference to her current role, as the butterfly in some cultures are symbols of transition between life and death and can symbolize rebirth as well. The butterfly motif is present in other parts of Hutao's design as well, such as her abilities. So while Hutao comes from a long line of funeral directors, her role has seemingly evolved with the times. Of course, this role related to the afterlife and managing the border might well be something the funeral home directors have long since done, but it has become more of a focus today. Her role as the ferryman of the deceased is also why she often disagrees with Baizu, who is actively looking for ways to extend life beyond its natural capacity. Hutao believes that life shouldn't be artificially extended, and when it is your time to leave, you should. It's likely she believes this because those who often linger in the border tend to be those who have had something they regret or unresolved business in the world of the living. In fact, she learned of this long ago and is what generally led her to getting a vision. When her grandfather, the 75th director of the Wangsheng funeral, passed on, Hutao was tasked with arranging his funeral service and rites. She did so impeccably and even gained the respect of many of the Parlor's more seasoned undertakers, despite being only in her teens at the time. After the ceremonies were completed, Hutao would immediately leave for the border. She wanted to send off her grandfather one last time, but despite waiting in the location for several days, her grandfather did not appear. It was here that Hutao learned from a passing spirit that those who had no regrets in life would not linger in the border and would immediately pass on to the afterlife. She realized the lesson behind this as this is what her grandfather had told her long ago. Live in life and die in death. Follow your heart and do what you can. Again, this is why she largely dislikes Baizu's attempts at changing the natural order, and not because of any business competition as it might appear on the surface. But I digress. Soon after leaving the border, she would find a Pyro vision amongst her possessions. It's implied that her vision was granted as a recognition of her strength and courage to venture into the border, but I think there's another reason. In truth, Hutao is actually quite indifferent to her vision. Most visions, as you know, are crystallizations of ambitions and dreams, and often many like to speculate as to why a particular element is granted. For example, anemo are thought to be given to those who wish to be free or have a carefree life or even have gained freedom recently. While there isn't anything to prove this, I think Hutao might be one of the few who received a particular element, likely because of her background. In the Staff of Homa law description, it tells the story of how the first Wangsheng funeral parlor director discovered the way to deal with the plague I mentioned earlier. While they were all facing their imminent destruction, a rather ominous but unknown voice spoke to the director. It told him that this plague could be cleansed through the purifying power of fire. This is what is presumed to be the original function of the Staff of Homa, a staff brimming with purifying elemental energy used to burn away infected corpses. This is what makes me think that given her heritage, the pyro element is largely the most suitable for Hutao as it ties directly to the legacy of her role and position. While she might not have any interest in combat or anything like that, she does consider her job as a funeral director to be very important, and it does make up a large part of who she is. Perhaps her dreams to ensure most are not left behind and allowed the right ceremonies to move on to the next life is why she was granted a vision, specifically a pyro one. Maybe she desires to fulfill her role as being the ferryman, much like Charon, and help those who have passed on to move into the afterlife leaving no regrets behind. Sometimes it's easy to forget that the dreams and ambitions of those in such a world like Tevat mustn't just revolve around combat and fighting. Hutao might be a rather good example of this. It isn't to say that she can't hold her own in combat, but rather dreams and ambitions can manifest in many different shapes and forms. And in Hutao's case, she is perfectly happy being the one who simply guides those to a more peaceful afterlife and providing their families some measure of closure. Perhaps the gods honor this sort of dream as well. That brings this video to an end. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. As usual, have a nice day.